Good morning and welcome. We'll give a couple minutes for some people to join in here, and then we can get started.
Hopefully that will be the end of my notification sounds. I don't know if those are coming through to you, Justin.
Okay. All right. You ready, Alex?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So good morning and welcome to the first of hopefully many open office hours with Alex and Justin. Our goal of this open office hours is to help bring some light to what we're seeing in the cyber insurance space related to the questionnaires. It seems like monthly we're getting different questionnaires from different carriers, as well as we are seeing a bunch of requirements that the insurance companies are now putting on us, the IT professionals. So we thought it would be good to have an opportunity to have the insurance brokers reach out to us, see what we're doing, at the same time list comments and questions that they might see that we could help answer related to this ever-changing environment. So if you scroll to the bottom of Zoom, you will see a section there that lists Q&A. All of the information sent is considered anonymous, so no one else will see your name if you do post a question. We're trying to keep it that way on purpose. Alex will see those and present them to me. Otherwise, Alex and I will just talk about some of the applications that we've gotten recently, and we will go from there. So, Alex, why don't you start us off? I know we looked at an application just the other day that you had, and we were going through it together, and we had some big flags that on yes and no questions and check boxes. So I think it would be a good opportunity to kind of drill through that one. And I forget who the carrier was. I know you have it up in front of you.
I believe it's Evolve.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there's a giant list here of check boxes and information you need to fill out. And I guess in order to fill this out, what would be your first course of action? I mean, it would be to call your IT people and say, hey, can you help me fill this out in order to get insured?
Typically, yes. So the insurance broker is going to reach out to their customer, send this application to them, and then the individual company should reach out to their IT provider to help facilitate that. If they don't really have an IT guy or do it in-house, I'm assuming the insurance broker is going to try to work closely with the customer to answer it to the best of their ability. But also, that's why we exist as consultants. We can help be brought in to help facilitate some of the questions that they don't know, or hey, can you come in on a one-off basis? And that is something as part of our cyber program we do offer now. But yes, typically they would call their IT, and hopefully the IT company has enough information to understand what the questions are, though many of the questions that we find are very vague. They're very yes or no. They're not a yes, we do 90% of this, but no, we don't do that. So we'll get into that as we kind of go through this questionnaire over the next 30 or so minutes.
So if I, forward this application to my IT team, me not being an IT person, how do I verify that their information is entered correctly or 100%? Where does the liability fall? Do I have to get them to sign some sort of liability agreement?
So at the bottom of the application, they do ask who filled this out, and there should be a level of responsibility on who's going to take that responsibility of signing off that this is accurate. And if you're unsure, everybody I've talked to, brokers, actual underwriters, when we've had conversations for some of our larger accounts, is the person actually filling out stating that this is what we believe honestly is the answer. Okay. And we always lean towards, if you're unsure, lean towards more the no than the yes. Okay. Because we don't want to assume, we don't want the carrier to assume that there is a protection in place and then there is a breach or there is some sort of compromise and they go to file a claim and a forensic IT person determines that it was not in place. Now there's cause for them to deny a claim. So we never want to have that. So the onus falls on kind of both the IT professional as well as the owner of the business to make sure that they answer these honestly. And how it is today, if some stuff's going to change in the next period of time, we've done it. Add a piece of paper, cross off stuff, write notes, do things on the application to let the underwriter know that, hey, it's this way right now, but we're actually already in the process of changing it. And it's going to be in place within this period of time. So we find that to be very, very helpful in selling your story about what your tech has, because no two companies are alike.
Okay. And I see a few questions here about your patching process and how routine your vulnerability scanning is. Is there guidelines that, or are they different between carriers for how often those things should be done?
So the answer is yes. First off, every company needs to patch their systems. Okay. TTR basically does a 60-day patch schedule for anything that's not considered day zero. So a day zero patch is a patch that Microsoft releases usually out of its normal schedule, stating, hey, this is a major, major vulnerability. We need to get this out and we need you to do it right away. Those patches typically get set within 48 hours. However, the typical security patches for Microsoft Office, Windows, they get released on a monthly basis. However, Microsoft uses us as a beta tester. So we'll install those and then typically they break something else, either the computer itself. It could break an application like QuickBooks. We've seen that. Teams, Zoom, all kinds of different things it could break. VPN recently was a big one. It broke IPsec. So we typically wait 60 days from the time of release before we push them out. That gives us enough wiggle room to hear what's going on. However, I know on the Travelers app, they've been pushing more 30-day patch. Do you patch? And they specifically say, do you patch within 30 days? What does the Evolve application say?
I don't see an actual stipulation here, just a field to fill it in.
Okay. So they're looking for what they call probably best practices. Okay. I mean, there is no right answer to this question other than, are you patching? That's the right answer. Okay. To say, yes, we could do it in 30 days, but that's great. And that helps the insurance company, but it puts the IT and the business in a vulnerable state if it starts breaking stuff. Okay. So yes, I need security, but at the same time, am I opening up new problems for my team and my staff because our IT team hasn't completely vetted a patch and let it kind of flow through the market before we push it? So typically what I'll do on an application is I'll list our best practice. Here's what we do. If they can provide logical reason why we need to do it in 30 days for that particular customer, we'll have a discussion with the underwriter and say, okay, give me that reason. Why is 60 days worse than 30? Kind of industry standard in large corporations, about 90, because they need to lab it, put it in sandboxes and everything before they roll it out to 10,000 users. So the demand of 30 days is, in my opinion, a little strong, but it's basically starting a conversation. That's the whole point about it. But the correct answer is, are you patching and how frequent? And then also specify that your day zeros, and that needs to be written in there, because again, are you patching? Yes, it's 60 days, but they think every patch is 60 days. Well, we specify that day zeros are done within 48 hours. So just something to look at?
They mention penetration testing, and I know that procedure can be extraordinarily invasive. To what degree should a penetration test be done, and how routinely?
Okay. So a pen test is basically you're hiring a professional, almost hacker, and I guess is the right word, to find vulnerabilities in your network that your internal security team have not uncovered. Okay. However, in most small to mid-sized businesses, they are using off-the-shelf product. Okay. Example, QuickBooks, they might use an industry-specific line of business application, something specific to their industry. Okay, if it's a Sage product, if it's a Profit 21 or an A2000, there's hundreds of applications that are written specifically for the industry of that customer. A penetration test, that the professional vulnerability tester is going to go in and look for ways he can break into the application. He's going to use brute force methods. He's going to look for what we call CVEs related to that application, or common CVEs and the type of code that the program was written in. The issue with a pen test, however, is that's great, but half the time, the vendor, if there is a vulnerability, they're not going to fix it. Okay. So if I go find a vulnerability in QuickBooks, that's great. I can tell my customer you have a vulnerability in QuickBooks. I can email QuickBooks, but they're not one of the companies that are probably go out and fix a vulnerability very quickly, like a Microsoft. Microsoft does a great job in their patching. They just sometimes release them a little too quick. But if you report a day zero or you report a CVE, typically within 45 days, that patch is released. So asking a small business to spend $10 to $20 to $30,000 to complete a test like a pen test is probably a little overkill to get cyber liability insurance. They should do a vulnerability scan and a risk assessment, okay, to know where we can maybe tighten up an area that might have a employee vulnerability, or hey, let's lock this down with two-factor because it's exposed to the internet and there's nothing we can do it. Excuse me, there's nothing we can do about it. But there's really an underlying request to see these pen tests, which are really not going to do much for a small to mid-sized company. The only time it really plays is if you have custom designed software. So you're a Schwab or some large financial institution, and you wrote your applications that your customer service and your internal people are using day in and day out. You want to have someone that didn't design it and isn't managing it come in and try to break into it. That's where a pen test would be really valuable.
Okay. And you had mentioned small to medium-sized businesses. How do we determine how much coverage we should get, like what our premiums should be? And how expensive is it to get covered typically for let's say a medium-sized business, 20 users?
Okay, that's a great question. So a lot of times the brokers will help talk to the customer. They'll kind of come up with their own typical number. Typically it's sold in $500,000 buckets. So 500 grand, $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million. And then there's different types of aggregates that they can either hit certain minimums depending on what type of breach occurs. So they could have $1 million policy, but they could have sublimits of only 20 or 30,000 of each individual. So we want to look at that. We also want to look at their type of data and their revenue. Okay. So that's why it's so important for small businesses to go through a incident response or go through a cyber risk assessment or a vulnerability scan, go through one of these simulations to kind of see how much downtime are they going to occur. because part of the cyber liability insurance is business interruption. So if you're down for 4 days, how much revenue is lost? What is my average daily sale? What does my week look like from a revenue side? Am I a car dealership or do I make widgets? Okay, we really need to kind of look at the business from a macro level first, then kind of hone in on the type of data they have. So if I'm an accounting firm, I'm going to have a lot of financial data stored in spreadsheets. I'm going to have a lot of data stored in PDFs. Maybe I have tax forms with EIN numbers or partner social securities. So we kind of need to first also figure out how big the data pool is, okay? Just because you're a mid-sized business doesn't necessarily mean that you are a you have a huge risk, okay? It's really about the data that you have, okay? And then you can kind of facilitate that down to, okay, how much data is this worth, okay? There's all kind of metrics on the internet, from the cost per record. Is it $20 a record? At one point, people were saying it was $100 a record. We kind of lean between $30 to $60 a record, okay? And then you also got to look at the records and how they're being stored and how many times they're in the system. So for example, if you have an accounting firm that has a social security number, that social security number, if it gets compromised one time or it gets compromised 40 times because it's in there 40 different spreadsheets, it doesn't really matter. And that kind of has to come out of the equation of some of the software we run or the analysis that you might do, because you, like I said, your social security number is either at risk or it's not. There's not like this in between. And oh, they got it 40 times versus they got it once. It really doesn't matter. They're going to sell that on the dark web regardless of how many times they got it.
Now, I don't have an open question here, but this is a question I get a lot from my cybersecurity talks. So one of the questions I get is about the what we call second gen AV antivirus.
Yep.
So a lot of the time I'll say we'll need to implement something, what we call next level antivirus. Now, I'll usually get hit with, well, I have antivirus. We use ESET, we use Norton. What is the difference between, next level, next gen AV and your, I guess, legacy antivirus?
Okay, great question. So next generation antivirus is something that's been around for probably 3 to 4 years now, but it's really starting to take a foothold basically in the last 24 months or so. The difference, so let's kind of go back first and talk about traditional antivirus. So we get installed on a workstation and it relies solely on what we call definitions. So think of it as an endless encyclopedia that needs to get built, okay? And this encyclopedia has to go out somewhere and get information. So if a file comes into my computer that encyclopedia does not know about, it's going to automatically assume the file is good, okay? So until an ESET, a Norton, a Kaspersky, a Bitdefender, any of those first gen antiviruses, I guess we'll call them, the flaw in them is unless it knows what it's doing or looks for a specific file information, it's going to assume everything is good, okay? So what next generation antivirus does, and there's different types, there's XDR, MDR, EDR, okay, and there's different flavors and what's included. Some are hybrid, first gen and second gen. But the big difference between second generation is the ability to use artificial intelligence and machine learning, okay? So it's going to learn what your system does on a day in and day out basis and as an aggregate across your company. And then in addition to that, it's going to have some booby traps built in for like ransomware. So they're going to hide some files on a workstation that if this file gets renamed, it's going to set off a trigger. Okay. It's going to look for patterns. So if it starts to see that, wait, typically XYZ company renames or changes 50 files a day. So using a bell curve, that might mean, all right, 100, anything over 150 a day, set off a trigger. Okay. It uses that machine learning to say, wait, something's not right. Now, the difference between, and there's different versions of the the next gens, they typically are not a remediation tool. They are more of a response tool, like EDR, endpoint detection and response. It necessarily is not going to remove the problem. It's more of to prevent a catastrophic problem. You still want to pair that typically with a first gen antivirus, because if it gets in and the definitions get updated, it can help remove it. It's supposed to minimize the impact that the attack could have. So if it starts to see a ransomware, hey, isolate this computer immediately. There's usually what we call a security operations center, a SOC, that's monitoring a type of data, and they're monitoring these 24 hours a day, and they'll get an alert, and then they'll pick up the phone and call the IT person that's supposedly the vendor that's managing it, or whatever that looks like. So it's usually in conjunction, but that's the whole point behind why the insurance companies want it, is they want someone to call some IT guy to pull the plug before it takes over the entire network.
Cool. And I mean, with that custom threat intelligence box on this particular form, would that second gen AV fulfill that category?
Yes, most cases. You have to talk to your IT provider and decide which of the different methods they want to go with. Sometimes you could do, for example, like an ESET, which is a first gen, with more like a basic EDR, like a Huntress Labs, or you could go with a combo, which is like a CrowdStrike or a SentinelOne type application. It really just depends on the infrastructure, what kind of footprint the IT firm has, and that's just a conversation between the owner of the company and the IT, or the decision by the internal IT director himself.
Okay, now I don't see in this form anyway, they have the categories that we're to cover, but is there some sort of official list? Let's say, does Evolve accept ESET or Norton Antivirus? Do they reject McAfee or some other version? Is there an official supported list we can get from these vendors?
Typically not. I would assume, just like a lot of our compliance that you hear from HIPAA, the SEC, FINRA, they're not going to list specific vendors because A, it makes them look bad, okay, that they're pigeonholing a certain company. They just want to make sure that you A, have it, and B, that you're going to own it as a supported application, okay? So not to say McAfee's bad, not to say ESET's good, not to say Huntress is bad, not to say SentinelOne is good. They don't care as long as you can say, hey, we're paying for and we're utilizing this. So that way you're basically, all you're doing is a testing that you have it in place. If you don't turn it on, or you're not scanning or not using it, that kind of falls then on you, when a breach would come in and a forensic IT person would look and say, okay, look, you told us you had an antivirus, but you haven't definition upgrade in 6 months. Okay. All they want to do is they're just trying to come up with a formula to determine what your risk is and what your premium should be. So it's a very, not a black and white kind of thing. They just want to make sure you're using something, and they don't care who it is, as long as it meets the criteria.
I see. Now, let's say I'm running a small business and I have a lot of employees working from home. I see mobile device encryption is one of the categories here. Do these forms take into account the personal devices, laptops, cell phones, etc., do they add to your liability if say they get email on their phone, stuff like that?
So it does add a cost. I mean, it adds a risk 100% because statistically 92.4% of all attacks come through email. So having your email on your phone, having email on a personal laptop, stuff like that does pose a vulnerability. Typically, they'll ask if you have some sort of multi-factor in addition to the mobile device management or encryption. The encryption part of it probably more leans towards when we read that question. And again, sometimes their questions are not clear. I'll go back to an underwriter and say, give me clarity on this. I don't want to assume I'm answering yes because I think it's A and you think it's B, because they're not always black and white. So we'll cross questions off, write questions back. But they more are probably looking for a laptop being encrypted outside the office. So that way, if I was in New York City and I left my laptop in a taxi cab, some IT professional, okay, couldn't gain access to that laptop, exfiltrate the hard drive and read the data that might be stored on it. Emails, personal information, PII, PHI. So having an encrypted device that leaves the entity provides security to the insurance company that if someone did lose a piece of equipment, that data wouldn't get leaked. It would be unless they had the magic key, which is very, very hard because they're usually AES 256 encrypted.
Okay. Now, there's a couple other stipulations here. One being the web application firewall, and another being a perimeter firewall. Now, how am I to tell the difference between the two? A perimeter firewall and a web application firewall. They also have listed here an application whitelisting, which to me would say, well, if we have a web application firewall, that would be something that is, it would cover both checkboxes.
So again, it's going to come down to what their definitions are. Okay. So if they didn't include it like a definition page on their applications, I've seen a couple vendors do. Not everybody does. That might be something you have to kind of go back and ask. So we'll kind of take each one of those three individually, and I hope I can answer the one properly. I'm hoping that's what they're guessing. So the first thing is a perimeter firewall. So this would be an appliance device sitting at the perimeter of your network. Okay. So that would be some sort of next-gen firewall, SonicWall, WatchGuard, Cisco ASA, some unit sitting inside the office that is intercepting traffic, both inbound and outbound from your network to make sure that that just not data is being connected to the network, like the internet. You don't have your modem, your Comcast or your Verizon or whoever your ISP might be connected right into the internet. And all that data is just totally exposed. There's some sort of buffer between you and that internet and whoever can gain access to that. So adding that perimeter firewall allows the company to just block certain things, certain types of traffic, certain websites. Most of these have like 5 or 6 different categories, which is we can talk about in another call, that are built in. But typically it's a unit that sits at the connected to your network that hopefully protects the outsider from getting in. And if they do have to come in, they usually provide a secure method called VPN. An application firewall is probably more either tied to Microsoft Azure. So if your stuff's stored in the cloud, are they using some kind of programming to where you're limiting access via IPs from people's homes? Are you using what they now call like basically security appliances? So my laptop on this network is the only thing with this MAC address is the only thing through this application that can connect to our office. If it doesn't have that application installed, it's not allowed to connect. It looks for a particular agent to basically create the tunnel to the applications. Or they could even go as far as some sort of application firewall, like only these users with these IPs could come into our application because it's got the very sensitive information, like an EMR or some sort of financial database, something like that. And then the other thing you listed was application whitelisting. This is something brand new. It's kind of the new hot fad in the cybersecurity world. We also refer to it as zero trust. This is where everything in the network gets shut down unless you enable it and say it's an authorized application. So typically an application gets installed on all the workstations. They go into what they call a learning mode for about 30 to 45 days. We see what the users do, what printers they use, what applications they run, and it builds a little library of what they have. And then at some point, we put them into what they call lockdown mode or application whitelisting mode. At that point, nothing can get installed on that workstation unless it's an approved update by IT or the company, or you have that magic password that allows the installer. This is the hot thing because now if someone does download a virus or it sits in his computer or a hacker wants to install ransomware because he's got access, he won't have that ability because the application needs to be improved that he's trying to run. This is something that companies are starting to test and starting to implement. It's a lot easier to implement in a smaller organization than a larger one. A, because of the number of applications, but B, it's all the user interaction. So the day you turn it live or that you want to probably do it by department, it's going to cause a little bit of friction in your typical day-to-day office environment. You probably want to have someone monitor it. And then typically once it's live in that department for 3 to 4 days, it kind of just runs. And until there's an update of an app, and it does do the common application. So you don't have to worry about it blocking Zoom or Teams or things like that. It assumes that they're going to have their individual updates, and they also monitor for those updates, that as long as it's an approved app. But if you have a custom application and you need to roll out a patch, you need to approve it and then roll it out accordingly because your own system will block you.
Okay. And to get into a little bit of the policies and procedures, I see listed here an incident response plan. So is there some sort of formalized way of writing this stuff? Are there legalities involved? And do they have to be corroborated by a lawyer? How are they forged? And how do we know that our IT people have a correct incident response plan?
So the first question about the legality aspect of it. No, an incident response plan is not a legal document. It's an internal policy document. If you were having employees sign like a BYOD, like, hey, you're going to use your cell phone and we have the rights to do X, Y, and Z, then yes, you'd want to have your HR attorney make sure all the language is correct. Okay, especially if you go on the internet and you buy a template. An incident response plan is a new document. It kind of goes in part with your disaster recovery plan. So an incident response plan is kind of like a fire drill plan if and when a cyber incident occurs. Okay, so and everything that goes along with it needs to be documented. So not every situation requires a remediation. So you define what in your incident response plan requires basically an incident. So hypothetically, we go back to that conversation we had earlier regarding the 50 files per day. And then you have that trigger hit with your SOC that says, oh, today you changed 230. You call the customer and you find out why, the user. Oh, I was requested for my CPA. I needed to copy a whole bunch of files and it turns out to be the CFO. Okay, that's technically not an incident, but it set off one of your cybersecurity metrics listed in your incident response plan. So you would just refer to that as a SIM event, security, basically documentation. There's a full-on management word for it, and I'm losing it off the top of my head. But basically, is that just a report? Okay, you did your drill, you executed it, no incident. Okay, and you're going to probably get 20, 30, 40 of them a year. okay, that go along because you have to define what needs to be reviewed. If you just say, oh, someone copied some files and you didn't look into it, the incident response plan is kind of like foolish. It's saying like, hey, we might have a fire in the kitchen, but we have all these fire drills. It's never a real fire, okay, until it really is.
Yeah.
So the same case applies here. You're going to basically go ahead and simulate what an event might look like. And if there is a breach, how are we going to define it, respond to it, and then like remediate it? There's typically like 5 steps, okay? When you're building out the plan, identifying, remediation, all these other key pieces, we don't have to get into that right now, but basically is how fast can we recover, okay? And who's responsible? So if we have an attack or we unrecognize this file, XYZ company is going to get called and we're going to bring in their people to review the network, or they already have access. Okay, we were able to define what we call patient 0, which is the computer that's doing most of the bad acting. Shut it off, put it on an island. How quickly can our switches isolate that? Okay, to help, again, minimize the attack. And that's what the insurance company is trying to do because of what went on over the last 2 years when they didn't have all these requirements in place, okay? A ransomware would get hit. So now they're trying to put the onus back on IT just a little bit. They understand a breach or a compromise is not foolproof. It can happen and probably will happen at some point to most businesses. They're just trying to mitigate it so it's not a total disaster. If they had let's take a fire, for example, you'd rather have one house burned down than a whole block, okay? That's kind of what they're trying to do here, is they're trying to isolate it to one system versus 4,000 systems, okay?
There is a employee awareness training field. Now, is this something that is provided by the IT company? Are there any official lists or anything that you need to subscribe to fulfill this category?
Repeat that one more time. I want to make sure I understand the question.
Employee awareness training. Are there any official procedures, I mean, I guess this kind of goes in line with the official list of firewalls. So I know typically we use Breach Secure now. Is that something that would fulfill this requirement for employee awareness training? Is there any kind of standard procedure for it?
Not really. Basically, as what they're looking for here is that you educate your employees, okay? I would assume, I haven't spoken to an underwriter directly, and I might bring it up on the next time I have a conversation with one, that could a manager of an office just have, hey, we're gonna have a weekly huddle, we'll bring in lunch for the team, and we're just gonna talk about some stuff, or have our IT professional come in and talk about what a phishing event is, what a spearfish is, what a social engineering campaign might be, things like that. I would assume would qualify to meet employee training. There's not clear definition that you have to have an employee take a test. Yeah. Most of the services that are out there do. They're typically a couple dollars a user per month, so not very expensive. They're done in 4K. They hit the typical, you watch them on your computer, they're done on like small videos, and then management has a portal that they can sign off on that they completed it. Otherwise, you're handing a piece of paper around, everybody's got to sign their name that they attended. Not everybody's available. That's usually part of the problem for corporate trainings. So we typically want to have some sort of paid service, and there's plenty out there. Like you mentioned, BSN is one, but there's Mimecast offers one, Breach, No B4 is another one. Like there's so many of them out there.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. I don't think they care. They're just seeing that the customer is making an effort towards enhancing their cybersecurity posture. And I think that's what the whole point of these minimum requirements are, is that the companies have a cybersecurity posture that they're trying to implement, again, just to minimize. You're taking a gazillion number of companies out there and you're trying to fit them into a number. So, hey, we feel like the companies that do X, Y, and Z have a tendency to have less breaches, have more minimal breaches and events than the company who just does nothing.
So let's say, we want to check off this box and we have a month of missed training. Is that something that an insurance company can come back and say, hey, listen, we did not go, we found that this training wasn't done. Can they refute a claim because you checked that box and, maybe did not meet the requirement?
So unless they specifically give you a requirement, okay,
Okay.
that might be a tough one to deny a claim against, I guess would be the right question, because they're not saying, hey, you must have every employee meet a minimum of 1 month. If it's spelled out, then yeah, I would say they could probably defute it. Whereas if you say, hey, we have antivirus and the computer that got compromised clearly didn't, okay, that's pretty black and white, okay? It's going to be hard to dispute. However, they might find cause that you were negligent or maybe only cover part of a claim. But that is a great question, Alex. And that's what we're trying to show in this program, that none of this is perfect, okay? And having the conversations, especially with your larger clients, and really digging into these applications, okay, are important, because there is no right or wrong answers, okay? There is no clear, definitive, hey, if I check every box, I'm going to get a premium of X, Y, and Z, okay? Yeah. They're using industries that are very risky. For example, our industry, very risky. Financial, very risky. Accounting, very risky. I make light bulbs, probably not as risky, okay? They still have risk, but they're going to use that in coming up with their formulas. However, is a company that has 50,000 records but has all the check boxes probably in a better situation and going to probably get the lower premium? Will it still beat that company making the light bulbs? Probably not, just because of the amount of data and the cost if a breach ever to occur. However, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to be free, but it's going to be hopefully heavily discounted.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, so, this is Evolve's cybersecurity form. Are there differences typically between different insurance companies? Is there a reason why maybe Evolve would reject us and another company wouldn't?
So it really depends, and the answer is yes, depending on the type of industry, depending on their risk portfolio, okay? Many brokers will shop 3 or 4 carriers. We'll get these applications depending, they'll usually go to their kind of number one or who they were with last year to try to see how much has changed. Are they going to still insure that individual based on an industry? Some cyber carriers are getting out of the market because in certain industries, because it's just too risky. So they'll take an application, but Evolve might insure company A, but if you submit them also to travelers might deny them based on their questionnaire. That's why it's very, very important to know what you have, how often, how many records, what you got, what your IT does, work closely with them. This is typically not and depending on what service plan they have, a free engagement. This is hours typically of work unless they have a full-on program already established. So, but yes, most cases we'll see 2, 3, 4 applications for the exact same client with 4 different premiums, varied from 5,000 to 30,000 sometimes. It all depends on how much they value those different check boxes. And they have a scorecard, I'm assuming, on how they come up with those premiums. I have not been privy, probably will and never will, on how they come up with their numbers.
Okay, I think that's a decent closing question. We covered a good amount. And I figured we're at a solid 45 minutes here. You want to close this one out and let everybody know how they can get in touch with us next week?
Yeah, sure. So it's every other week. We're going to start off at least in the very beginning. We're going to post this to, we're going to start a YouTube channel, Vimeo account. We're going to get this posted. Hopefully our attendance increases as we start to roll these Q&A sessions out. I know it's new. So it's every other Tuesday at 10 to start. Our hope is this evolves into more of a cybersecurity overall talk, not only for insurance brokers, but for all business owners or all people in security, that we can bring in some experts that are those pen tests and explain what a pen test really goes deep into. We can bring in some of the vendors that are out there, like a Huntress or Total, and have them talk about or what's a SOC, and have some of those vendors come in and really bring their businesses to light and why companies need to do it. But we're going to start right now for at least the next couple, just with the insurance broker, see how that goes, and then we'll take it from there. So Alex, this has been fun. I thank our attendees for the time, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thanks,
Beautiful.
and talk to you soon.
Take care.